In a previous video, we saw how neuroplasticity works. We saw how our brain is capable of physically changing itself. So if one of the functions of brain is not really fulfilled, that part of the brain which is responsible for that function is dedicated to some other function, right? So actually our brain physically changes in response to our learning, our environment and our genetics, which is a very interesting case. But neuroplasticity, one of the most interesting real life cases was the real life case of a person called as Phineas Gaze. Let's learn about his tragic accident and what happened to him, right? Phineas Gaze is often referred to as the man who actually began neuroscience. He experienced a traumatic brain injury when an iron rod was driven through his skull, destroying much of his frontal lobe in the brain. Gage miraculously survived the accident. However, his personality and behavior were so changed as a result of the frontal lobe damage that many of his friends described him as almost a different person entirely. The impact that the accident has had helped us better understand what the frontal lobe does, especially in relation to personality. Let's look at his accident in detail. On September 13th, 1848, in Vermont, 25-year-old Phineas Gaze was working as the foreman of a crew preparing a railroad bed near Cavendish. He was using an iron tamping rod to pack explosive powder into a hole. Unfortunately, the powder detonated, sending the 43-inch long, 1.25-inch diameter rod hurling upwards. The rod penetrated Gaze's left cheek, tore through his brain, and exited his skull before landing 80 feet away. Gaze not only survived the initial injury but was able to speak and walk to a nearby cart so he could be taken into town to be seen by a doctor. He was still conscious later that evening and able to recount the names of his co-workers. Can you believe it? Gaze even suggested that he didn't wish to see his friends since he would be back in a work in day or two anyways. After developing an infection, Gaze spent September 23 to October 3rd in a semi-comatose state. On October 7th, he took his first steps out of bed, and by October 11th, his intellectual functioning began to improve. Description of his injury and mental changes were made by Dr. John Martin Harlow. Much of what researchers know about the case is based on Harlow's observations. Harlow noted that Gaze knew how much time had passed since the accident and remembered clearly how the accident occurred, but had difficulty estimating the size and amounts of money. But within a month, the Gaze was actually well enough to leave the house. Can you imagine it? It was a miracle. In the months that followed, Gaze returned to his parents' home in New Hampshire to recuperate. When Harlow saw Gaze again the following year, the doctor noted that while Gaze had lost vision in his eye and was left with obvious scars from the accident, he was in good physical health and appeared recovered. The type of injury sustained by Phineas Gaze could have been fatal. While it cannot be said with certainty why Gaze was able to survive the accident, let alone recover from the injury and still function, there are several theories. Some researchers suggest that the rod's path likely played a role in Gaze's survival, in that if it had penetrated other areas of the head, Gaze may have bled to death. The brain's selective recruitment. In a 2022 study of another individual who also had an iron rod go through his skull, whom researchers refer to as modern day Phineas Gaze, it was found that the brain is able to selectively recruit non-injured areas to help perform functions which were previously assigned to the injured portion. This was the example of neuroplasticity. And others theorize that Gaze's work provided him structure, positively contributing to his recovery and aiding in his rehabilitation. But what were the actual effects of his injury? Popular reports of Gaze often depict him as a hard-working, pleasant man prior to the accident. Post-accident, these reports describe him as a changed man, suggesting that the injury had transformed him into a surly, aggressive, heavy drinker who was unable to hold down a job. Harlow presented that the first account of changes in Gaze's behavior following the accident were absolutely tragic. Before the accident, he was energetic, motivated, and shrewd, but after the accident, actually there is little evidence of exact extent of Gaze's injuries aside from Harlow's report, so it's difficult to know exactly how severely his brain was damaged. In a 1994 study, researchers utilized neuroimaging techniques to reconstruct Phineas Gaze's skull and determine the exact placement of that injury. Their findings indicate that he suffered injuries to both the left and right prefrontal cortices, which would result in problems with emotional processing and rational decision making. Gaze's case had a tremendous influence on early neurology. The specific changes observed in his behavior pointed to the emerging theories about the localization of brain function, or the idea that certain functions are associated with specific areas of the brain. In those years, neurology was in infancy. Gaze's extraordinary story served as one of the first sources of evidence that the frontal lobe was involved in personality. Today, scientists better understand a role that frontal cortex has to play in important higher order functions like reasoning, language, and social cognition. So, what actually happened to him after accident? After accident, Gaze actually survived for 11 years, although his condition went on deteriorating in later years. But after the accident, his behavior noted significant changes. He was unable to continue his previous job. He spent some time traveling through New England and Europe with tamping iron to earn money, supposedly even appearing in the Barnum American Museum in New York. He also worked briefly at a livery stable in New Hampshire and then spent 7 years as a stagecoach driver in Chile. He eventually moved to San Francisco to live with his mother as his health deteriorated. After a series of epileptic seizures, Gaze died on May 21, 1860, almost 12 years after his accident. But his behavior in later years had changed completely. Earlier, the very pleasant, always happy-go-lucky and hard-working Phineas Gaze had turned into a very aggressive and violent person. He had become extremely angry. He had developed attention deficit issues. He was not able to focus on anything. Also, he had become sexually very dominant and aggressive person. He could not control himself and also indulged in very gestures which are not appreciated, sexual gestures. 7 years after his death, Gaye's body was exhumed. His brother gave his skull and tamping rod to Dr. Harlow, who subsequently donated them to the Harvard School of Medicine, and today they are still exhibited in its museum. In 1948, Phineas Gaze, actually 1848, he had a workplace accident in which iron tamping rod entered and exited his skull. He survived, but it is said that his personality changed as a result of which, leading to greater understanding of brain regions involved in personality, namely the frontal lobe. His accident and subsequent experiences serve as a historical example of how case studies can be used to look at unique situations that could not be replicated in a lab. What researchers learned from his injury played an important role in the early days of neurology and helped scientists gain a better understanding of the human brain and the impact that damage could have on the functioning and behavior. Right? Post accident, his demeanor was said to have changed from pleasant to surly, and he went from hardworking, motivated man who had trouble keeping a steady job. Right? So his accident helped us teach different parts of brain play a role in different functions. Through studying Phineas Gage's frontal lobe damage, we gained a better understanding of what the frontal cortex does with regards to personality. We also began to know more about the effects of frontal lobe damage and how it may change a person. This was the very interesting real life case of Phineas Gaze. Thank you so much for listening.